Today, I just wanted to give you an overview of some recent advances that we made related to quantifying element maps. Why should we actually quantify our maps? So I'm just going to throw here some basic examples. First thing first, if you have element maps of calcium, sodium, potassium, you can easily pull out the end-member composition in some minerals. For instance, here in a beautiful plagioclase from the Admelo tonalite. If you want, you can also look at some trace elements. For this, of course, we will be looking at a much smaller field of view, but you can see the partitioning of the different elements, hafnium, yttrium, phosphorus, and uranium, for instance, here in zircon. And just for reference here, I'm putting here this 10 microns diameter, which could correspond to the laser spot beam that you will apply on your zircon. So just be aware that minerals are zoned, and sometimes this zoning is at the micron scale. And such quantified maps can show you that beautifully. You can also deal with multiple phase element mapping, where here we are looking at the Jawbridge rhyolites, where we have a K-feldspar with two different generations of K-feldspar, a barium poor one and a barium richer one. And we get this full area quantified, including also the plagioclase and also the glass matrix that is in there. And all these data are perfectly accurate. So it's basically my take-home message here as an introductions. You should definitely quantify your maps to the best level of accuracy that the microprobes can provide you. And all that can also provide you with precise quantitative analysis similar to point analysis. We'll see that how we go through that. So I'll just remind you a few things about electron microprobe principles. Get through indeed these principles of mapping. How do we do that and how do we quantify them? And we'll have a proof of concept by just analyzing the secondary standards. I have here many different applications that I will go through today. Depending on the times I may cut on some, we will see how it goes. So the electron microprobes, we do have here this column that most of you do know already that generate electrons. The electrons are being focused and land on your samples down here. And the electron beam size vary between around 10 nanometer up to maybe 1 microns or a little bit more. Of course, we do not analyze the surface, but we do analyze effectively a volume. We'll see that also. So when the electrons arrive in your samples, they interact with the materials. There are many signals that are generated. Among them, there is one very important one, which is the characteristic X-rays. So this so-called characteristics X-rays are characteristic of an element, and they are used to calculate the element concentration. And we do that using this so-called WDS or WD spectrometer, wavelength dispersive spectrometer, which helps us actually filtering out X-rays of a specific wavelength using this monochromator that is situated here, and that is diffracting back the X-rays of interest down there to the detector. So we just basically count X-ray. Now, how do we go from counts to weight percent? The principle is very relatively simple. The ratio of the intensity that we measure, being the intensity of the characteristic X-ray, so that means you have to subtract any background intensity, the Bremsstrahlung. So this intensity that you measure of a certain elements divided by the same intensity, the intensity of the same element in a standard of known composition, you multiply this by the concentration of the standards. This is approximately equal to the concentration of that element in your unknown. It's only approximative because you have all these factors, the famous ZAF factor, which are regrouped under this so-called matrix correction. So I will not go into detail about the matrix correction, but this is here, down here, the equation that we use to quantify a single point analysis on the microprobe. And so we will basically use this approach to quantify every single pixels of an element map. So how do we do an element map? Well, first you have to choose, of course, the element or elements of interest. You tune each spectrometer to target these specific elements. You define an area that you want to map. Once you have your area, you define also the condition of analysis, the voltage, the currents, the counting time, etc., etc. And more importantly, also you choose wisely your pixel size. So here I have this simple animated GIF showing the rastering of a 5 by 5 pixels matrix over a certain phase of interest, and this will be pixelated and translated into a certain intensity, usually as a grayscale map. So, of course, choosing the pixel size is very important. Taking again these very simple examples with this 5 by 5 matrix, if you concentrate on the localizing this yellow phase and quantifying that yellow phase, this kind of map will be totally horrible, because if you look at the pixels, the individual pixels that goes over your yellow phase, you basically have no pixel at all that covers entirely this phase. And so if you increase the number of pixels, going for instance to a 40 by 40 grids, you then finally start having multiple pixels that covers the phase of interest. In that case here, we would have 13 pixels that are entirely at 100% inside the phase of interest, and maybe 8 pixels that have partial coverage over 50%. So this kind of maps on the top left, where we just barely pass over the phase of interest, would be very useful if you want to rapidly locate a phase. But for quantifying, you definitely need more like a setting like this. Rastering. So we have here two different ways to get a map. We can either have a so-called beam mapping, where we place the beam, we deflect the beam over the area of interest, and we basically scan over this area. This is totally suitable, but only for phases that are very small, less than 50 microns. Beyond that, you will start having defocusing effects. So if you have larger area, you would rather do a stage mapping, where in that case, the electron beam here stay fixed, and we displace the stage to cover the area of interest. So the beam mapping will see one applications actually using this so-called time-dependent intensity correction. So this would be for the case where you have extremely beam-sensitive materials, where you rather wants to rapidly scans over and over and over and aggregates the intensity you get over time. Whereas this one is definitely more suitable for millimeters area or hundreds microns or more. You just have to be careful, of course. You can go with exceedingly long acquisition times. So you'll have here to play with the size of your pixels, for instance. The interaction volume. So you've probably seen this figure if you had participated to one of my class already many times. Basically, I'm showing you here the electron interaction in solid materials as a function of the acceleration voltage we are using. So basically the energy we are giving to the electrons, versus here, the density or the average atomic number, Z bar. So we can see that with an acceleration voltage much higher, we get a much larger volume that is being analyzed. So if you were, for instance, here to determine some pearthites at the micron scales, a 20 kilo electron volts gun will not help you a lot, because we will have basically here a huge volume being analyzed, much larger than the features that you want to highlight. So in this case, you may have to drop the voltage. Of course, having denser materials helps, because with denser materials, we also reduce that volume. That being said, you can see that this schematic, these diagrams is shown with different color for the path of each electrons, going from yellow down to blue. So this yellow to blue describe actually the energy loss of the electrons across the material. We have also this red paths here, which are basically the electrons that get back out of the materials. These are the so-called backscattered electrons. Now, coming back to this loss of energy, when we are targeting X-rays, we need a certain minimum energy to generate that X-ray. And so if I take here the examples of the 20 kilo electron volts, I'm highlighting here in red a zone where all electrons have an energy at least 10 kilo electron volts or above. And this volume here, this is where the electrons will be high energy enough to ionize and create an X-rays from zinc K alpha. So all the signal from the zinc will actually come from this volume. Whereas if we look at lower X-ray energies, like iron K alpha, we will need only 7 kilo electron volts. So this will represent this slightly larger volume. And if we look at very light, low energy X-rays or light elements, silicon K alpha, for instance, we only need 2 kilo electron volts. So just barely 10% of our initial acceleration voltage. And in that case, the volume is getting much larger. So you have to take into consideration all that when you are preparing your map. Just a note also that basically all the X-rays that are generated deep inside the materials, they will rarely manage to get out of the materials and will likely get absorbed. So most of the signal will still stem from probably the upper 1 or 2 microns. So to get the full quantification, I share with you the paper, because actually today I don't want to go into too much details about the calculations, but I just want to show you some nice examples and open a discussion about what we can do. But basically, all the maps that I will present you have been corrected for backgrounds, and the background correction is done either by acquiring a maps of the backgrounds or by using this so-called mean atomic number background correction. We do apply some drift in standard intensity and also in the beam currents. We also considered standards to do the quantification. So this is a standard-based quantification, and we apply these complete matrix corrections. With these tools that we have additional options. We can correct potentially for beam damage using this time-dependent intensity correction. We can correct for peak interferences if you have 2 X-rays that are too close together, that they sum up and they give you a fake signal. We can use multiple spectrometers for better precision on some trace elements analysis. We can also add some elements that we have not measured. So this could be typically oxygens that we usually constrain by stoichiometry. This could be the OH group. Of course, we cannot see hydrogen on the microprobe. Or this could be also the carbonate group for carbonates. And finally, I hope that in the near future, we will be able to do combined EDS and WDS element mapping. This is unfortunately not yet available due to some software incompatibility, but hopefully an update will come soon. So in the interest of time, I'll maybe skip on these 2 slides, but it basically describes the how we proceed to quantify these maps. So we take for every single pixels all these corrections into account. We acquire also, of course, standards, and then all these informations enter in this double loop where we correct for the backgrounds using the mean atomic number background correction. We do a peak interference corrections, we calculate the K ratios, and we enter this loop here where we do the matrix corrections. Then we come out of this first loop and enter back in these other loops where we check for convergence of the peak interferences corrections and the mean atomic number background intensities. When everything is good, then we get out of the loop and we output the pixels and we continue with the next pixel. So just a brief word about the mean atomic number background correction, a long name, just to state that it is a standard-based calibration curve for the background. So basically what we have measured here, all these single green dots are actually standards. In that case, we are looking at the intensity of fluorine K alpha using the LD1 monochromator versus the average atomic number. And we see here that they all line up relatively nicely. One key thing is that all these standards, they actually have absolutely no fluorine content whatsoever, and they have no X-ray lines that might interfere with fluorine K alpha. So basically all these measurements are measurements of the backgrounds. And so once we have calibrated this curve, these backgrounds, we can then go to these diagrams, determines the average atomic number, which is a proxy, if you want, for the density of the material. So once we know the average atomic number, let's say 15.5, we can take that curve and determines here precisely what is the backgrounds for that material. So this technique is really wonderful because it works as low as down to 200, 500 ppm for accurate results. And basically for maps, this is absolutely ideal because we don't need to acquire a second map where we would have the background measurements. So this is really the way to go for background correction. So the proof of concept, we have here a simple example. We are looking at the NIST glass 411, which is a certified glass, which basically has a pyroxene composition. You can see that these maps are kind of boring. That's actually what we expect. It's a homogeneous glass. But as you can see, rather with the numbers, I have here averaged all the pixels that have been quantified, and you can see that we do have a perfect match with the expected composition. Notice also that our maps suggest that there could be contamination by aluminum. There could be maybe 200 ppm of aluminum. It seemed that other peoples might have reported the presence of these trace amounts of aluminum in this pyroxene glass. But anyway, so that's just to show you that these techniques can be relatively sensitive. One thing also to realize is that between the minimum and the maximums, we have a large variability. This is also to be expected because basically the precision we have on every single pixels of this map is awful. It's horrible. We count for just barely here 500 milliseconds to compare with 20,000 milliseconds or 20 seconds for regular measurements for major elements. So the statistics on a single point is bad, but if you take the average, you can get accurate and precise analysis. So let's jump into some examples. We have here this beautiful pleasure clays I show you in the entry slide. This comes from the Adamello tonalite, thanks to Dr. Friedrich for giving me this sample. And you can see here that we have the row maps as they come out after just the mapping. So these are here just maps of counts. And you can see, for instance, on the calcium map, it's kind of hard to see the zoning because we have, unfortunately, a bunch of apatite that have an extremely high signal. So we say we have the same problems here with the potassium, where actually we do have biotite and muscovites that are surrounding, or I don't know exactly what this potassium phase might be. Actually, this could be some Feldspar and some mica of some kind. But basically, we don't see any zoning, potential zoning in potassium. So we go through the quantification process using probe for EPMA for getting the standards information and running the quantification process using these softwares called CalcImage. And at the end, you got these colorful maps. Well, of course, the colors, you choose whatever you want. But here we have now the maps with the range of variations in weight percent that is actually representative of what we expect for our plagioclase. And you can see now on the potassium map, whereas here we would see absolutely nothing, we can finally see here a nice correlations with the decrease in calcium and naturally a slight increase in the potassium content. So these maps are gorgeous. They can help you determining different zoning. And well, you could get maybe the same kind of data by just getting point analysis. But without knowing clearly how the zoning looks like, it might be hard to get representative data of all these different zones in your plagioclase. And plagioclase can have this oscillatory zoning, which renders the point analysis even more difficult. Moreover, once you have these maps, again, we can extract other data, like something that speaks more to us, that is atomic proportion. These atomic proportions, here I have performed an oxygen normalization based on 8 oxygens, and now we see the atom per formula units, and we can directly pull out actually the anorthite, albite, and Feldspar components. And that's what I did here. So once we have the atoms, we have the different composition of the plagioclase in albite, anorthite, and Feldspar components. And also, if you want to do some statistics, you can, from these maps, get easily histograms to know what is the proportion of this calcium-rich core versus, for instance, the albitic rim that we see at the end. There are way more data that can get off this software. For instance, you can have a map of the detection limits. Well, it won't vary by so much. You see here, down here, this detection limits maps. But basically, that gives you an idea of what kind of detectability you have for each different elements. There are some elements we perform well. There are others, it's a little bit more difficult. Sodium, typically, we usually have a poor counting statistics and we'll get a high detection limits. On the contrary, we perform very, very well on the calcium and to some extent also on silicon and aluminum. We can have also a map of the relative analytical sensitivity. So that will help you not to over-interpret your results. So you know that, for instance, when you have a very high calcium content, of course, your data will be a little bit more sensitive maybe around 3%, plus minus 3%. Whereas once you reach this albetic rim, you'll get a poorer statistics and of course, a poorer sensitivity. The trace elements, so we rarely do trace elements mapping by electron microprobes at the map scale because it's usually take forever. So I should say that whereas these first maps on the Feldspar lasted for 3 hours, these other maps for trace elements in zircons lasted for 8.2 hours, which is quite a long time. So you may not want to do that a lot of times, but sometimes it's necessary. On this figure, I'm comparing here actually the two types of background corrections. So the typical background correction is by acquiring a background map, and then we subtract the background from the peak maps, we subtract the background map. The other options is this mean atomic number background correction. And you can see that basically the results are exactly similar. You see here also in a profile that all curves, both curves, the red one and the blue one. So the red one is the mean atomic number, and the blue ones is from the the background's correction. So you see that there is a good match. Now, one interesting thing regarding the statistics, look at the uranium map. You see that the 2-point background corrections will generate pretty noisy data, whereas the mean atomic number background will have a more clearer image. This is related to the fact that in that case, with the mean atomic number, we constrain the backgrounds using this calibrated curve, which is actually very precise. We have very little error on that background curve. However, when you get your background map, you have an extremely poor statistics. Your precision is horrible. And of course, the total error you'll get on your results will depend not only in that case on the peak measurements, but also on the error you obtain on your backgrounds, which is much, much, much higher. So basically acquiring the backgrounds will add noise in your image. So that is yet another reason to use the mean atomic number background correction. Now, regarding peak interferences, this is here a classical examples of sulfur K alpha being interfered by another lines, in that case, molybdenum L alpha. We are looking here at pyrite, chalcopyrite, and you can see that, of course, the iron and the sulfur. And now?
Yes, now it works again.
Okay, good. All right.
Thank you.
Sorry for this technical difficulty. So coming back to these problems of sulfur and molybdenum. So once again, we have here a pyrite with a lot of iron. We have a chalcopyrite with a little bit less iron, full loaded with copper. No copper, of course, in the pyrites, and the sulfur here present in both. Problem is with this row map, I'll put back my pointer. This row map here of molybdenum K alpha, L alpha, sorry, this is a typo, L alpha line. On this row counts per seconds maps, it looks like we have a lot of molybdenum in both phases. If we don't apply any corrections, we come up with almost like 2% molybdenum in the pyrites and around 1% molybdenum in the chalcopyrite. And this is all fake, absolutely fake. If we do apply the interference correction, we finally come with the accurate result. That is absolutely nothing in terms of molybdenum in both the pyrites and the chalcopyrites. And that was actually a little bit of a surprise. We suddenly found this phase here, which we suspect is actually a scheelite, calcium tungstate, that has trace amounts of molybdenum. And with these interference corrections, you can finally see that clearly. So just be aware of these kind of problems. There is here just a summary. This is this line profile A to B, where you can see that the totals are nicely clustered around 100% for the pyrites, a little bit less for the chalcopyrites, probably because there are some other elements. And the key points here to keep in mind is this fake molybdenum that we can measure here if we don't apply the interference correction. And with the interference corrections, you can see that we have an accurate blank value. Basically, we have proven that to the detectability of the molybdenum, we have absolutely no molybdenum in either the pyrites or the chalcopyrite. Carbonate maps. So this is here a samples of Lotta. She came one day and told me, oh, it's weird. I have some very strange manganese content, very high, and I'm not sure what's going on. So I suggested her that we do indeed some mapping. So this is a samples of the lost city serpentinite, which is a low temperature alterations, which has indeed this manganese rich carbonate. The carbon, of course, in these maps is not measured, but we can constrain it by stoichiometry simply by saying that for every 3 oxygen atoms, we should have 1 carbon atom. We measure 5 cations, calcium, magnesium, iron, and manganese for sure, sometimes strontium, and sometimes we rather opt for silicon, because here with these nasty samples that are strongly altered, hydrothermally altered, we have a lot of teeny inclusions of silicates, and we don't want to have the signal stemming from these silicates. We really want to have the signal coming from the carbonate itself. So you can see here these maps quantified, and we have effectively nicely shown here that we do have effectively this rim of this dolomite that is enriched in manganese. We do have also here a vein of almost pure calcite. And all these maps, just basically show you the possible zoning that you have in your mineral. So I think Esteban is also on the chat here, I mean on the Zoom meeting. That's the kind of map that we can get. And with this, you can very easily differentiate calcite from magnesium-rich calcite, from proto-dolomite, from dolomite, from whatever you want. Notice also that for this map, I acquire it in just 20 minutes, even less. So you can get relatively fast results with that. So let's have a closer look now. Now I'm introducing you here an options that is in this software, which is pixel filtering. So you want the best data. So if you are looking at carbonate, for instance, you may want to exclude every pixels that show you a high signal in silicon. Here, for instance, more than 0.5%. I can also filter my pixels by saying any totals that are too low or too high, I exclude them. The too high totals might correspond, for instance, to the silicates here, where actually we force the calculations of CO2. And of course, there is no CO2 in that in these pixels. So the totals will be high, but we ignore them. The low totals can correspond to wrong analysis, I mean bad analysis. Maybe there was like a crack, or we are at the rim of a grain or something like this. Once we have done that, we can use a tool to either select square area, or we can even define polygons, and we can extract the pixel information from this polygon and get an average. So you see here the results of quantification of a 10 by 10 square, so only 100 pixels. And we have what I considered as relatively nice results, except maybe for this dolomite. I'm not sure exactly what's going on. Either we have analyzed, we have missed something, or possibly I had some issue with the calibration of magnesium. I'm not so sure, but for the carbonates, we perform very, very well. Notice that for point number 4, for instance, here, we have a few black pixels. These black pixels are these so-called bad pixels, notably because we had some signal from silicon, but we have removed it. And so when you take your average, then for these points, we don't have any more 100 pixels, but we have only 88, 12 of them being removed based on our filtering criteria. Now, if we look at the statistics, it's awful, as I told you. If we have just a look at this 100 pixels for the point number 3, these are here the results, the individual results of the manganese oxide content in weight percent. And you can see that, of course, the variation is horrible. But actually, since we do repeat the measurements basically 100 times for 100 pixels, our standard error, which is basically the standard deviation divided by the square root of the number of pixels, this standard error becomes much more affordable. To sum up, with this 100 pixels, and considering our dwell time, so the times we spend on each pixels, which is here 50 milliseconds, we basically have here each analysis represent like a 5 seconds analysis. So you can imagine that this is relatively short and probably leading to some relatively imprecise results. But we can make our square a little bit bigger to improve the statistics and then ultimately reach the precision that we can get with quantitative point analysis. Beam sensitive materials can be very challenging for mapping. I'm showing you here a study I did on some extremely nasty materials. These are alkali rich, so sodium and potassium hydrosulfates, jarosite and naturalonite. In these samples, the question is, what kind of substitutions do we observe? We have two kinds of substitutions. There is a potassium for sodium, and there is also substitutions on the trivalent cations, iron for aluminium. So for that, I did several beam mapping, but this time, instead of doing just one map, I did multiple passes, 5 to 8. So 5 passes at a beam current of 100 nanoamps, or 8 passes at the lower beam currents. And I tried different dwell time. And you can see that on the first top row here, we have relatively low conditions, low currents. I mean, 15 nanoamps is quite a lot, but it's relatively low for mapping. 5 milliseconds, extremely short acquisition. And you can see that on the first map acquired and the last map acquired, so the 8th one, you see basically no difference. In this case, you can opt to aggregate all your pixels, and then you'll get a precise map. Or you can choose to correct for potential damage and have here this so-called time-dependent intensity correction. So basically, every single pixel, since we have 8 passes, every single pixels will have 8 measurements, and they are time-stamped. So we can potentially correct for that. If we start increasing what we call the electron dose, that is the product of the currents and the time, we start seeing interesting things. For instance, here at this 100 nanoamps 5 milliseconds setting, we start seeing here at the first pass a zone that is rich in potassium. However, on the last pass, on the last scanning, you see that this zone rich in potassium is now poor in potassium. This is an effect of the diffusion. And it's not simply just diffusions, but it seems that, I mean, yes, it is diffusion, but it seems that some zones are getting actually sometimes enriched in that element, sometimes are getting depleted. This is even better seen here on the harshest map, where we have this potassium-rich zone here, which totally vanished here, and we suddenly start having this like sink for potassium in this zone. So the bottom line is that once you have this kind of strong beam damage, if you were to average your pixel, you have certainly a good map. It looks good, but it is inexact. It is inaccurate because we do have damage and diffusion of potassium. Whereas if we apply the time-dependent intensity corrections, we end up again with some good results. So this is here the same maps, just showing you here some numbers. I'm comparing 2 points here. I mean, that's the same set of pixels here, but in one case, I considered the time-dependent intensity correction, the other time, the aggregated intensity, so summing just the signals of all the different scans. And you can see that in the first case, where we don't have so much damage, the TDI and the aggregated results are relatively similar. But as soon as you start having harsh conditions where we damage the grain, you can see that if you apply the TDI, you have the right results, the correct results. But if you look at the aggregated intensity, you suddenly have a huge increase in sulfur content, in iron content, and the potassium is dramatically dropping down. So just be aware of that. The most beautiful maps with the highest currents and the longest counting time might not be suitable for such beam-sensitive material. Just for the fun, these are here animated GIF of these maps that I just showed you. And we can nicely see the migration, basically, of the potassium leaving, for instance, this area to migrate into this domain here. And the same goes for here. And this is here just a brief schematic of how the TDI works. So as I told you, we have multiple frames. So for each pixels, we have multiple points analysis that have been time-stamped on the x-axis. And we see here the possible change in intensity. And if we don't have any trends, we can basically take the average of everything and we'll get precise and accurate results. But if we if you do have a trend, you have to correct for that. Otherwise, if you take the average, you will get inaccurate results. This is here a fun project that I just started with a PhD student, Valentine Berger from pharmaceutical here at ETH. And she was analyzing teeth, actually cavities in teeth. And she wanted to have a look at the fluorine. And she started, of course, going at SCOPEM and looking at fluorine by EDS. Big mistakes. This is here her EDS map. Can you say something out of that? Not really. So I took her samples, decided for a mapping area over these zones where she think there was maybe some fluorine. And of course, there was an enrichment in fluorine, but the contents are so low that the EDS map will rarely provide you with good results. Also, and a word of caution, on the EDS, there is always a way to quantify, and that's what she was doing. She was quantifying several pixels here, but the thing is that she was not even considering using standards, but using just like factory-based calibration, which is another problem. So anyway, these maps by WDS show very nicely what she was expecting, that is here an enrichment of the fluorine inside this cavity part of the teeth, whereas here the same part of the teeth is totally homogeneous. Another beautiful examples, this time in Garnet. This is Dr. Miguel Cisneros that wanted to do some Garnet mapping. And I immediately told him, well, if you want maps, why don't we quantify them? And he was so excited that actually we ended up mapping something like 12 garnets or even more. But basically, Miguel is working with Whitney Baer and John Pratt for determining the pressure of entrapments of quartz inclusions in garnets. And in the future, he will also use the zoning of these garnets to determine the pressure and temperature conditions. So there are a lot of things you can do with these maps once they are quantified. Another examples of garnets, this time with the spessartine garnets from Sarah Dagan. So Sarah just started a master project with me and Eric, and some people's at the Swiss Geological Institute. And the Swiss Geological Institute has this gorgeous spessartine gem quality garnets that have been collected in Namibia, but the region exactly where it comes from is relatively unknown. And they are trying to target back the rocks that are at the origin of this spessartine. And the first test was to check if the spessartine were homogeneous. And even if they look very nice, they are totally not homogeneous. So you can just observe that on the pictures. I think it's quite clear. The next questions, of course, in her work will be to do some thermobarometry. So we will see how it works. These are pretty unusual manganese-rich garnets, so that could be some challenge. But having now here these quantified maps, we can easily extract, pull out quantitative data from these maps and get some PT path, for instance, reconstituted from that. This is here brand fresh. So these are acquisitions from last week and last weekend with Lucas Simio. Lucas is working with me and also with Ludmila and Olivier to work on this granite of Pikes Peak in Colorado. And we started by just having an overall qualitative or semi-quantitative map of the entire scene section. So here you can see that in 6 hours, we can have a full overview of the scene sections, which can help you to get not only an idea of what kind of plagioclase, for instance, this one in zone 1, what kind of plagioclase are zoned, how strongly are they zoned. You can observe also beautiful perthites. You can also observe different plagioclase generation, etc., etc. And here in these other granites, I think this one is really gorgeous because you have this rapakili texture. So you have this K-feldspar that is rimmed by plagioclase. You have also myrmekites in there. And these maps just show you everything immediately. We have here a nice zoning in plagioclase that is immediately visible. So once we have these overview maps, we can consider getting into the phase of interest, like in this case, looking more closely at this potassium feldspar that is sitting here with a few plagioclase, which we thought were possibly primary plagioclase. And effectively, we can see here on this calcium map that we do have a primary plagioclase that is extremely rich in calcium. And we do have in this matrix the perthitic K-feldspar with a few lamellas of what looks like very albitic plagioclase. And so once we observe that, we can potentially go a little bit closer, like I will go and zoom in inside this area and get, for instance, a much higher detailed map here at 0.5 microns step size, where we can see very nicely the albites that has been like formed through this pelletization. But actually this grain here, looking at the calcium map, and I'm here maybe a little bit over-interpreting, these are again fresh news, but it could be here that this was a primary plagioclase that got chewed up and albitized. Whereas down here on the corner, you can still see micrograins that are probably still primary plagioclase due to their higher calcium content, anorthite components. Just to finish here, nice examples, that was this barium map that I showed you at the beginning. I just wanted to again emphasize that we can get not only traverse, like I show you here, with all elements in multiple phases, and all this data are really accurate with average totals approaching 100% for the plagioclase and K-feldspar, and down to maybe 90% for the glass. I should say I did not measure the iron and the magnesium, so that's possibly why the glass totals are a little bit too low, sorry. But one thing really to emphasize is that on these maps, I did actually use 3 spectrometers to measure the barium. And with that, I get superb precision. And the black line that you see here is actually the value determined precisely by point analysis. And it is a perfect match with my quantitative map. So we needed here, in that case, 2 passes, because we had first the major elements, silicon, aluminum, calcium, sodium, potassium. And then we had this second pass with chiefly the barium. And I tried also to get some strontium data, but in this class, we didn't get, I mean, in these samples, we didn't get so much strontium. So the maps was pretty useless. So I'm gonna leave you here, just throwing here this pyroxenic solution, which is another quantitative map. And I just put it there because indeed Ben might want to publish something about that. We'll see. All right. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do we have some questions from the audience? Oops.
I would have one. Nice talk to you, yeah?
Yes.
Can you show slide, I think it was 22 again, where you had the individual pixel analysis of one of these maps?
22, you said? Easier. No, the 22 is carbonate. This one?
This one, the right bottom right corner with the no, one back, please. Bottom right, the individual
Yes.
pixels, I suppose, and the weight percent, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
If you were to plot this as a histogram, would you get some sort of Gaussian or Poisson distribution, or what would you get, or are they completely random?
Yes, Gaussian. We have that in the paper, I think. Let me just, you see my paper here?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, there you go.
Okay.
So this is here, for instance, what you obtain. This is on this NIST class. So you get a perfectly Gaussian distribution, yes.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions?
I have one regarding the man correction and the 2 points background. So you said here that the man correction is better for the trace cell element, right?
It's better for everything.
Okay. Even for major elements like calcium, potassium, or that kind of things.
Even better. So the major elements is really great. And for trace elements, we might think that it's not a good idea because indeed we are limited with the accuracy of these corrections when we reach very low quantity, around indeed 200, 500 ppm. But in that case, for the zircons, we actually got very nice maps, even at very low concentration. So Oops, I should maybe share the screen first. Sorry, once again. All right. So yeah, in this case, we got variations that was going from 0 to 2000 ppm. And effectively, the man here worked kind of nice. But the problem is that this curve can easily get shifted up and down due to slight inaccuracy in this mean atomic number background correction. And so in this case, there is one way also to improve the mean atomic number background corrections, which is to actually apply what we call a blank correction. So that's getting a little bit more complicated probably, but basically with these blank corrections, we would get a similar map or simply a point analysis of, for instance, a synthetic zircons that would have absolutely no uranium. And we measure the uranium content in these zircons. And if we get systematically like slightly positive results or slightly negative results, we can use that to correct for a possible shift. But
Okay,
otherwise,
okay.
in general, I would say if you want precise trace element map, you should still probably get the 2 points method. But once again, the microprobe is not really made for this kind of trace elements maps. We can get maybe trace elements analysis, which will have much better precision and much better accuracy. But here I was just showing indeed some kind of extreme. But I would not recommend to do trace elements analysis using maps.
Sure, sure. So the basic rule is from now on, we always try to use the man correction over the 2 points background correction.
Yes, yes, because you've seen the maps we have programmed together for the full scene sections, or even just like the local K-Feldspar. Each maps was between 2 and 4 hours. If you have to acquire 1 or even better 2 backgrounds, you multiply your analysis time by 2 or 3.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I also have a question. And so in general, those maps are less precise than spot analysis, right? So
let me show you something. So yes, every single pixel has a very, very poor statistics. Mm-hmm. Let's have a look actually in live in CalcImage. What do you want to look at? Garnet, Feldspar, Carbonate?
Maybe Feldspar with some more.
Maybe some Feldspar. So this is here the Feldspar of Luca. So we have here this map, and I'm going to enter actually the image processing. And I can, using this menu, extract shape, profiles, and polygon area or filter pixels. I can actually get my quantitative analysis. So I'm loading here a file, which is a relatively big file, 14 megabytes, which contains all the maps as oxide weight percent. I could have chosen, of course, also atomic weight percent. The first thing I want to do is get rid of all the pixels that are not plagioclase. So I'm activating here my filtering. I'm saying I don't want any pixels that are between less than 90% or over 110%. I want to get rid of this quartz. So I'm going to set the maximum silica content to 80%. And let's start with that. I'm filtering. And we have here basically all the pixels that correspond to plagioclase. I can switch here maybe to another element, let's say calcium. So let's filter it again. And now I can choose here. So you have here, this is the results of the sum of all pixels. This is here your standard error.
Oh, okay.
I think it's hard to do better with a point analysis.
Yeah.
Now, effectively, if we take a pixel width of 1, so here I'm starting to extracting information. I have here 1 point. This is the statistics I get on 1 point analysis. Actually, these are 4 pixels. It cannot do 1. So it's 4 pixels, and you get extremely poor statistics. But as soon as I increase the number of pixels, like 20 by 20, this will be then 400 pixels. If I get here my average, I get gorgeous results. Okay. And with that, I will then get the precision of a point analysis. The only downside of this approach, of course, is that if you were to select the points like here, you are basically at the zone where the calcium is changing.
Yeah.
So by averaging too much, you will start losing the primary information, which is the spatial information.
Okay, perfect.
Does
Thank
it
you.
answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Can I ask a question
Yes.
a bit more into sort of the spatial resolution? I should say I'm not at all an expert on any of these analysis methods, but I was recently collaborating with some people who were using electron probe point measurements to quantify some specs in a melt inclusion. And they were saying that for whatever reasons it was, their beam size, they couldn't constrain it enough to just get that material alone without sort of like getting some of the rims in.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any way that you can use those statistics on the mapping to improve the spatial resolution in a situation like that? Or is basically if your point measurement isn't well enough resolved, your map is not going to do anything for you?
That's a good question. I guess there could be a possibility to correct for that, providing you know the composition of the matrix. So if you think partial contamination of, you're trying to analyze your melt inclusion, included in pyroxene, for instance.
Well, it's even a bit more complicated than that. It's actually an inclusion inside the melt inclusion. So the melt inclusion is made of two materials, and
Yeah, it sounds like an impossible mission there. So typically controlling the beam size is one thing, but treating the maps, you would have to do probably some Monte Carlo simulation, I guess.
Right.
And try to compare what the simulation tells you versus what signals you have. What people are doing, but this is more towards like thin film analysis, but that could actually help in this case, is multiple voltage analysis. Mm-hmm. So with multiple voltage analysis, you basically sample larger and larger volumes, and you'll get like change in intensities. And there are softwares that can model this. Right now, this model are actually only in 2 dimensions. So you cannot model for 3-dimension stuff. It's getting like really complicated. So I'm not sure.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thanks.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Okay, Julien, thanks for this super interesting and super understandable talk, although it's very difficult. My question is what is at the basis in the sense of recent technological development, why you are speaking about this in the year 2021, and why has not this been done, let's say, I don't know, 10 years ago or 20 years ago? So did you say maybe at the very beginning of a presentation, the latest development that makes this possible and why it has not been possible before? I'm just curious.
So the first problem 10 or 20 years ago was computation power, basically, because running a matrix corrections is nowadays fast. It is done in a few seconds. But in the 90s, for instance, the computer were way too slow, and it would take like 2 days to process the maps. Even today, with powerful machines, some of these maps takes like an hour to be treated. The development is chiefly regarding the application itself and the software. So what is novel is really that we are now applying all these corrections that were known and applied to point analysis, but we do consider now pixel. And people have never been thinking of doing that because indeed, usually a map has a very poor statistics. And so we realized that actually, if you are careful in doing your matrix correction, even if you have a huge variability, you will still get very precise results by doing a little bit of averaging.
Okay, thanks.
So there has been other people, for instance, Pierre Lanary, that some of you probably know, has been developing this phase map tool, XMAP tool. And in his case, he's basically using a calibration curve. So you get 2 points in one specific phase. You get a linear trends, and you correlate your change in intensity with the change in element weight percent. And this is okay-ish for simple phases, plagioclase and garnets, providing you have point analysis in these phases. but it does not include all the matrix correction. It does not include the possible peak interferences. It doesn't include even a correct background correction, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it's not new that we are trying to quantify maps, but now we are quantifying to the state of the art.
Thanks, Julian.
Okay. Okay, so I think if there are no more questions, then
I just would have a second one, very quick one. You showed us also the maps, the stacked maps with 5/8 passages, and I just was thinking, how good is the stage reproducibility? I guess it's very very low, and we don't really care about it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have done it. But
No.
I just was, yeah.
That's a good point. So effectively, stage reproducibility can be a problem once you start getting down to 2 microns step size. Basically, our stage is normally guaranteed to be ±1 microns reproducible. My own testing is that after a while, especially along the y-axis, because we scan regularly along the y-axis, we start seeing more shift in the y-axis, and this is getting in the order of 2 microns. But this is actually not really a problem, because as soon as you get maps that are down to 1 microns or half a microns step size, so the size of the pixel, you will usually consider beam mapping. But otherwise, yeah, this is effectively something you have to be careful. If you have an old microprobes which does not have good maintenance and so on, you can have problems of shifting, line shifting